in 2009, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries. In 2015, under the Paris Agreement, parties agreed to extend this goal out to 2025. To date, some argue that this target is far from being met as the world prepares for COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. Let's hear the South African position now, and I'm joined by the Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, Dr. Dion. Dr. George, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. So as South Africa, you are planning to, the way you're approaching this summit is you are there in the main to advocate for large-scale financial support to enable developing nations to meet their climate targets. Is that what you're about?
Well, there are a number of things that we are looking for at COP29. It's all about the finances in this particular COP, but we also need to look at mitigation and we need to look at adaptation. Now, for example, you mentioned earlier that there was $100 billion that was promised by the developed economy countries to pay for an energy transition in the developing economy countries. Now, we've had quite a lot of debate on whether that $100 billion was paid or not, because there is no specific accounting standards and there's no single spreadsheet to indicate that it was. But I think the point that South Africa's been making for a while now is that irrespective of whether that $100 billion was in fact paid or not, it's hopelessly inadequate. So our position going into COP29 is that if we look at the new collective quantified goal that needs to be discussed, we think that a region of $1.3 trillion per annum is more realistic as a contribution from the developed economy countries. Now, of course, that's a large amount of money, but if we do want to get the transition done, it does need to be paid for. And it is so that the developing economy countries such as South Africa have got a significant amount of debt and that we can't take on additional debt. We'll probably hear a bit more about that tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is we can't take on an additional amount of debt onto the national balance sheet, and that is why we need to get concessional, highly concessional or grant funding. And that's what the conversation has been about. I was at pre-COP a couple of weeks ago where the conversation was started. My counterpart from Australia is co-chairing the MCQG stream, and that's basically to talk about the money. I am going to be co-chairing with Norway on the mitigation aspects. And that particularly is to saying, well, how are we going to cut back on the emissions that is polluting the atmosphere? We know the goal is to get to no more than 1.5 degree Celsius increase in temperature. Now, of course, we're not on track for that, but we are very much animated, obviously, as South Africa, which we are an emitter, we know that, and we want to have a just energy transition, but we have to go to pace that leaves nobody behind. And then also, if you look at adaptation, we know we already see the impact. Our country's getting drier and drier. We're already a water-scarce country. And we also see the terrible storms we've had in KwaZulu-Natal, the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. That's a direct consequence of climate change. And we need to adapt to that. So we need to look at the loss and damage fund, for example. How do you compensate people when their homes are damaged or destroyed when the storms come, because they're coming more frequently? So those are the three big areas that we're going to be focusing on at COP29.
I'll come back to adaptation and mitigation in a second, but what do you say to someone who says, look, this has got nothing to do with accounting standards. All of this is meant to fudge issues deliberately because there simply is, there's no will on the part of the developed nations to actually, deliver on the promises made.
I think that the developed economy countries are having difficulty because a number of them have got electorates that have moved their countries to the right. We also don't know what's going to happen in the United States next week. So these all are geopolitical matters that are unfolding in the world. And that does impact on the ability of the developed nations to contribute. But the point of South Africa also is that we need to have some honesty in this conversation. So what we need to know is, are we going to be getting funding or are we not? Because if we are not going to get funding, then we need to make a different kind of plan. We've already said that the global financial architecture needs to be looked at. That's one of our key priorities for the G20, because the cost of capital is too high. We've also said that there's a space for a new financial model for climate financing. But the basic building block would be the contribution from the developed economy countries. So those are conversations that we're going to be having at Baku, because we need to be honest about it. If we are going to get the funding, and this is an argument also brought forward by our JET IP partners, basically countries that have already given South Africa money for a transition, they're basically saying, look, we've made a lot of money available to you, but you're not using it. So the speed of our transition is not fast enough. Now, we do know that because we do need to speed it up. There certainly is political will to get that done with the new GNU in place, but the implementation has been difficult and slow. And that's something we know that we need to get sorted out on. So we don't need to be told that because we already know it. But it is so that if you aren't using money that you already have, then it's very difficult to argue for additional amounts of money, because obviously the counter argument will be, well, then you're not spending what you've got already. Why is it that you want more? What you're going to do with it? So we're very mindful of those. So the clear position of South Africa is that we have the political will to speed up our just energy transition. We have our plans in place. Minister of Electricity and Energy, Minister Ramaphosa, is working at pace to get the new energies in place. We've got to work on the transmission lines. We know that. And so we need to move along faster. But if we're going to get to achieve the goals, there needs to be a lot more money available for that, specifically for the developing economy nations. Another thing that we've raised very specifically is, we'll all remember that it was South Africa that came up with the concept of the just energy transition. And everybody accepts that as a fact, that everybody must move along together and not get left behind. But another question we're also asking is, exactly just for whom? Because there are some countries, specifically in Africa, to our north, who are really, really battling with the consequences of climate change, but their economies are a lot weaker than ours. So how do you assist those developing economy countries who are less fortunate than we are? How do you actually assist them as well? Because we know that the impact of climate change is disproportionately impactful on people who have less resources. So we can't lose sight of that. So our message going into Baku is that South Africa is a sensible participant on the global stage. We do occupy a very important position because we are non-aligned and we are friends with everyone. So we can communicate with everyone effectively, and we can build the bridges where there is a bit of a scratchy relationship going on. So as we go into Baku, our message is, we need a just energy transition. We need it to be speeding up. We need to be clear about the money we're going to get or not in the developing economies. And then we need to start talking about a new model for climate finance. And that conversation we will take as the president of the G20 next year, very much so, because it is one of our key priorities to start talking more robustly about the global financial architecture that is not working for developing economies such as ours and many others. The global south is not getting the deal that it should, especially the cost of capital is too high, and that is not in anybody's interest. So we believe that the conversation on the climate finance piece is a really good entree onto the conversation that we need to have on the global financial architecture. I will also be going to Davos in January with the president, where I'm sure this conversation will be continued. We've had the discussions also when we were at the United Nations, when we were discussing climate financing. So South Africa has very firmly placed its position onto the table. We think it's a very sensible one. We're getting traction, and we are most certainly going to play the part as a sensible partner in this existential crisis as we go forward.
You mentioned words, honestly, robustly, sensible. But isn't it a fact, though, that, the developed nations around the world have no history of benevolence, which they see this to be, really? Or is one being way too pessimistic?
I think you're being a bit pessimistic there. I do think that the political will exists in most of the nations of the world, in that recognizing that this is an existential crisis. And it is also so that the developed economy countries had the benefit of burning coal for hundreds of years, but now we are expected not to burn the coal, and we've got 200 years supply in the ground, for example. So where is the justice in that? And I think that that's the point that's been raised many times previously. But what we don't want to do is to harp on the past, because there's no point. I mean, we just got to learn the lessons from it. But we've got to look at the present and say, well, how do we make a better future here? So the conversations I've had with the developed economy countries so far has been down that road, is that we don't have to be fixated on what was or was not paid. So whether the 100 billion was paid or not, I don't see the point of running around in circles on that. What we should rather be fixated on is saying, okay, what can we agree now? So if we take 100 billion as a base, it should be higher. We believe it should be $1.3 trillion at least. But if it can't be that, then what can it be? What is the developing economy world going to be doing? And if they're not going to be doing anything, well, then what are the consequences of that? We're not going to get the transition done. And that's a nobody's...
To someone, Minister, who says, okay, I hear you, but where's the evidence that their mindset has changed and that whatever conversations you're going to have with them, you will in fact be listened to?
I think the evidence is already there, because we've already had pre-COP. And what pre-COP does, it sort of sets the scene for the actual COP. So I was in Baku a couple of weeks ago, where we already started the conversations on mitigation, because as I mentioned, I'm co-chairing that with Norway. And so we know those nations that are not particularly interested in tackling climate change. So we kind of it's getting clearer. But I do think that the conversations with the developed economy nations have been very constructive. So what their negotiators have done is to say, look, this is the amount of money that we intended to spend, and they've conceded that the amount of money was not what they said they would spend, although they're saying last year they did spend 100 billion. But of course, there is no specific accounting standard, and there is no specific one single spreadsheet. So there is that whether it was or wasn't. And as I say, that's why our position has been, well, we don't need to be stuck on that conversation. What we need to say is, let's agree whether there's going to be commitment going forward, because there has to be, because there is the Paris Agreement, and we're expecting countries to do what they say they will do. And certainly the articulation from the negotiators is that, and also the articulation from my fellow environment ministers that I've met from the developed economy world is that way. So we have no reason to believe that we will not get anywhere. But of course, the proof is in the eating. We'll see what happens at COP. I'm going to be leading the South African delegation there. And we've got a very good and able group of negotiators who've already started the process, because it's going to come up very soon. And I think we head into that optimistically, because we've got to remember that this is an annual thing. So there's going to be COP30 that's going to be in Brazil next year. And that's going to be a very big one, because that's where the nationally determined contributions are done. So what is every nation going to do to contribute towards the global goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius? And of course, South Africa's busy working on our nationally determined contributions as well. So it all hangs together really nicely.
Hopefully. The political journalist that I am, I cannot resist this. You're going into a country which has been criticized for their human rights record, where journalists, where activists and opposition politicians get thrown into jail. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think the issue is that Azerbaijan is the venue for COP. And the most important thing is that South Africa does actually need to show up, because if you're not at the table, you're not negotiating. So, I mean, that is the venue for where it is. And I think the most important thing is to focus on what is the outcome we want to achieve. It is possible that we can get a very sensible set of resolutions out of Baku that we can then take to Brazil and continue with them next year. So I think, well, certainly from my perspective, I am not the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. I'm also not the Minister of Defense. I'm the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And my remit is basically to focus on how are we going to tackle this existential crisis of climate change. So I think that, yes, indeed, there are some locations you'd rather maybe go to somewhere else. But the fact of the matter is that it is a very important gathering, and it is very important to be at the table. And also, as the United Nations has pointed out many times, and it is so, South Africa occupies a very special place in the world because we are one of those countries that communicates with everybody. We are non-aligned. We are friendly to everybody. And that gives us a position where we are able to cross bridges where other countries cannot do that. And that is why one of the reasons why we are co-chairing on the mitigation is because we can have those conversations because we are that kind of a country. Something that's very interesting to note is that Pretoria is only second in the world to the number of embassies next to Washington, D.C. And the reason for that is because we are capable of discussing differences and finding solutions. We've transitioned twice politically in my lifetime. We're able to do what other people are not able to do.
Well, the iron is not lost because, I mean, not too long ago, members of your political party would take issue with ministers going to Zimbabwe for SADC meetings. Only a week ago, the leader of your political party took issue with President Cyril Ramaphosa, saying Russia are friends of South Africa.
There is a thing called the separation between party and state. And I am a minister in the government of national unity. So as a member of the government, my unremitting and absolutely laser-sharp focus is to focus on what is in the best interests of South Africa and the people of South Africa. And that's everybody in South Africa. So yes, it is true that my party may have certain positions on various things, and that is fine, as does the ANC have particular positions on various things. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the position of the government of the day, because we are in fact a government of national unity and we have got priorities. And the priorities, as set out very eloquently by the President in the State of the Nation address, is that we want to unrelentingly tackle unemployment, inequality, and we need to generate jobs by growing our economy. So we need to focus on economic growth. And the only way we can do that, if we can transition to a low-carbon economy, because else we're going to have the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to be a tax on South Africa, and that's not going to be good for our economy. So we need to transition. And we are absolutely committed to do that transition and bring everybody with us as we go.
Dr. Dion George, thank you very much for your time. He's, of course, the Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, ahead, of course, of that UN Climate Change Conference, COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan.